All right, it's time to talk about something that's not progression in the weight room and percentages and repetitions. So I was really going to make this one of my fake Q&As, but I can't be bothered. So I want to talk about two related topics that sort of make the rounds in training, and one of them is making the rounds again, that people tend to ask questions about. And they're related in a couple ways. One is that I'm going to say a whole lot about each one to give you the background and the details. And then the other is that at the very end of it, I'm going to give you the exact same piece of advice regarding both of them. So the two topics I'm going to talk about today are the issue of muscle hypertrophy versus muscle hyperplasia, and that's the one that's currently kind of back in the discussion. And then the other one has to do with the issue of muscle fiber type conversions from one type to another. Like I said, I'm going to discuss both in way too much detail. Let me give you the exact same piece of advice regarding both of them. First up. So first up, I want to talk about the issue of skeletal muscle hypertrophy versus hyperplasia. And those terms describe an increase in muscle size due to either an increase in the size of the individual fibers, hypertrophy, or an increase in the number of fibers, hyperplasia. Now, this is a long-standing discussion that happens to be back in the conversation. It's a brand new paper that just came out that I'll come back to after I talk for too long. Okay, so some terminology and some definitions. The term hypertrophy refers to an increase in the size of cells or of something. The term hyperplasia refers to an increase in the actual number of those. Now I'm going to talk about skeletal muscle predominantly, but I do want to mention fat cells because I think it has a little bit of relevance. You've probably heard or read or seen it claimed that you're born with a certain number of fat cells and that number never changes. And that certainly was a belief decades ago, but it's not true. We are born with a certain number of fat cells, and that can differ between people. And when you gain fat, generally the fat cells get larger, they hypertrophy. But under certain conditions, the body will make more of them. Puberty is probably a place where it can occur. Pregnancy for women is another. We know now that when fat cells get to a certain size, they release growth factors that cause what are called pre-adipocytes, or baby adipocytes, to mature and turn into full-fledged fat cells. Basically, once it gets too full, the body makes more. There's also some drugs, the TZD drugs, and I can't pronounce what that stands for, thiazolidinide. It's a diabetic drug, and it lowers blood glucose by producing more, causing the body to make more fat cells. So there's a bigger sink for blood sugar, which is good in that it makes blood sugar down, and bad that it makes more person have more fat cells. I cited a study in the women's book that they overfed women and men, and the men predominantly increased fat cell size in their upper body, and women frequently increase fat cell number in the lower body. There also used to be an issue. They used to refer to hypertrophic versus hyperplastic obesity, which meant either people had fewer larger fat cells or more smaller fat cells. And that latter one is much, much, much harder to treat because larger fat cells release fat more easily and a bunch of bullshit. Read my Stubborn Fat Solution. I talk about all these details. Fat cells can also die, what's called apoptosis, although it's really under extreme conditions. Some die over very long periods of time, but certain drugs that they use for HIV and AIDS treatment can cause fat cells to die. I, for over a decade, have been pursuing the fat loss apoptosis project to no avail, because anything I found that could do it was either unbelievably bad for people, or if you release too much fat into the body at once, you can cause like autoimmune and lupus and shit. So I've kind of given up on that. And really, at this point, the only way to really truly get rid of fat cells is liposuction, where they're physically removed, cryolipolysis, which freezes them and causes them to die and be expelled, and some of these other new procedures. Anyway, let's talk about muscle again, which is what this is supposed to be about. So in the same way that fat cells can either get bigger or actually increase in number, We know that skeletal muscle hypertrophies, that the actual muscle fibers and myofibrils, which make them up, get bigger. But do they increase in number? Can muscle fiber hyperplasia occur, where you actually increase the number of muscle fibers, which then presumably can hypertrophy? Let's address that next. There is roughly a 40 or so year debate that has been going on about the issue of muscle hypertrophy versus muscle hyperplasia. And the first papers I'm really aware of it are late 1970s. And I think it was even had been observed before then. Specifically, this was an animal model in cats, where they had developed a cat model of training where that looked like this. And basically what this is showing is that his cat is having to sort of press against a lever with resistance on it. You can see the load down at the side to get food. So basically the cat would have to paw against this lever to get food, and then they would add weight over time, because even scientists in the 70s knew that progressive tension overload was the primary driver on hypertrophy. And a very early study did find that there was an increase in muscle fiber number. Now you may be wondering how they did it, and the answer is awful. In that when they do these animal studies, they will do the training, and they train one paw, not the other, and then they sacrifice the animal, which is a polite way of saying that they unalived it. And then there are various ways of counting muscle fibers, the most tedious way being by hand, where I kid you not, they go in and count them by hand, and there's some I'm not going to get into details on that. So that's really the first study I'm aware of that suggested that muscle fiber hyperplasia could occur. And a whole bunch more models will be developed for animal research. There's one that's very classical, an ablation model, where they take mice and they cut one muscle of a group and throw load onto the other one. But I think probably the most well-known or most famous one in terms of the hyperplasia issue was the stretch-mediated hypertrophy that was done on Japanese quail. So in as much as this looks like anything, they would basically put a weight on one of the quail's legs and leave the other one unweighted as a control. And they actually kept the leg weighted, which is putting stretch on the wing for 30 straight days. So, tons of relevance to training, especially to this stretch-mediated hypertrophy bullshit that's currently a fad in the industry. Because, holding that stretch position, definitely the same as 30 days of chronic stretch. Regardless, the early studies did show hyperplasia. And I'm not sure when the quail model first was developed, but probably one of the most impressive studies occurred in 1993, where Jose Antonio and Dr. Gagne, who had been, I think, part of this argument for quite a while, did a study where they took quail, and they not only did the 30-day stretch study, but they added weight to the wing over time. Progressive tension overload. That sounds familiar. And they found a shocking growth, 318% increase in muscle size at 28 days, with an 82% increase in muscle fiber number. It's important to realize that even in this study, the hypertrophy occurred first, and then the hyperplasia occurred afterwards, probably after the muscle fibers reached a certain critical size, just like in the fat cell model. So regardless of the debate, and there was a long-standing debate. There were two labs. I want to say it was Dr. Antonio and Dr. Gagne who were on this same paper. They were just butting heads over this. And the story I was told is that at one point, one of the labs, the lab that didn't think hyperplasia occurred, said, we're going to send our grad student to your lab to be on your next study, and he's going to hand count the fibers. Because we don't think it happens. So as long as we got our guy doing the grunt work, we're more willing to accept it if you actually find a positive result. And that shows a degree of intellectual integrity that just isn't seen in science anymore, at least not in exercise science. So it was fairly clear that in animals, at least, hyperplasia could occur, in addition to hypertrophy, and probably after a certain amount of hypertrophy had occurred. The problem is that none of these models, except maybe the cat thing, really had any relevance to how humans train. In that vein, it's worth noting, the growth you see in these animal models, like the ablation model or even in this quail study, are just massive. It's like 50% increase in muscle size in a matter of weeks, or this one was 300% in 30 days. And training studies just don't see that level of growth in humans, except for Brad Schoenfeld's lab. Ha ha ha. But in the real world, that just doesn't happen, which points out kind of the irrelevance of this. but at least it's proof of concept, in as much as skeletal muscle between species is similar, if not identical. It suggests that hyperplasia could be part of the overall growth response. So what about humans? So what about human data? Well, something that I'm going to harp on is that this is unbelievably difficult to study in humans, right? So in animals, you do the training study, one arm versus the other, one limb versus the other, one paw versus the other. Then you unalive the animal and you count muscle fibers, however you're going to do it, and compare sides. Now you have to assume, probably safely, that there's relatively similar numbers of fibers between sides, and you compare. The training side got bigger and more fibers, you can safely conclude that there was an increase in muscle fiber hyperplasia. Because obviously you can't do a training study in humans and then sacrifice them to measure the number of fibers to see what's going on. And again, I'll come back to some methodological issues in a second. So when you start looking at humans, the data is a lot more mixed than what you see in the animals. And there's a number of reasons for that I'll come back to. But when you're talking about humans, there's fundamentally two different ways that you can try to measure this. I'm going to assume for right now that we have some way of counting fiber number, so I'll come back to that. So one way is longitudinally. So you take a group of people or an individual and you get an estimate of their muscle fiber number in whatever muscle before the training study, and then you train them, and then you measure it again and see if fiber number has gone up rather. And by and large in those studies, the answer is no. Fiber number does not generally increase, if ever. These are typically short-term studies, which is relevant. But based on that, we would say no, hyperplasia does not occur, at least not to an amount worth worrying about. So that's one data set. But there is another data set that is based on cross-sectional studies. Now, in a cross-sectional study, you just take two groups of people. And for example, in this case, we might pick one group that was trained and one group that was untrained. And you measure muscle fiber number and just compare them between groups. And you either see that the fiber number is the same or the fiber number is different. Now, obviously, we're making huge assumptions. You know, muscle fiber number at any given muscle can be enormously different anyway, but this is statistically speaking, you compare them and see. And this is where the question starts to come in, because here is where data starts to show up that under certain conditions, hyperplasia might occur. So a couple of the early studies, and this was real common back in the 80s, looked at elite bodybuilders and powerlifters or both and compared them to either untrained or trained normals. Researchers probably figured, well, these are the biggest dudes. Let's see if we can find a comparison. So in 1982, McDougall compared the triceps of 5 elite bodybuilders, 2 elite powerlifters, to a number of trained normals. I think it had been trained for about 6 months. And what they found was that despite the bodybuilders and powerlifters having greater tricep strength and muscle cross-sectional area, the actual fibers were no larger than in the trained normal individuals. So think about that. We have elite bodybuilders and powerlifters whose muscles are bigger, but whose muscle fibers are the same size. The only way that's possible is if the bodybuilders and powerlifters had far more muscle fibers than the untrained individuals, or sorry, the moderately trained individuals. The difficulty being, were they born with those number of fibers, which suggests they were born with tons and tons and tons of tiny fibers that they grew to normal, or at some point did they experience hyperplasia? I would note that these athletes being elites were using anabolic steroids. And they saw some other differences. There were like some dysfunctional muscle fibers in the powerlifters and the bodybuilders. There was also greater sarcoplasmic volume. Remember sarcoplasmic hypertrophy in the bodybuilders? So even though they were bigger, their muscle fibers individually were the same size. So they had to have more. A couple years later, McDougall would again do a similar study. So this time, McDougall compared a number of elite bodybuilders, intermediate level bodybuilders, and untrained individuals. And this time he found that they actually had the same number of muscle fibers in the biceps, despite the bodybuilders being much larger. They did also find that the individuals with larger muscles tended to have more muscle fibers. But they concluded that probably the larger bodybuilders had been born with more muscle fibers, which they then were able to hypertrophy, which is why they were bigger. Although it's possible still that they experienced hyperplasia. It's also worth noting that, as in the previous study, a majority of both the elite and intermediate bodybuilders were using anabolic steroids. I don't intend to go through every paper on this topic like this because it's pointless. I'm just trying to make the point that this is kind of how these cross-sectional studies are done. Compare two groups, count muscle fibers. Maybe you see more, maybe you don't, but you can never know for sure if it's because they were born with more fibers that they grew, or if training over the long term led to hyperplasia. So let me look at one more relatively more recent study that gives a little bit more direct insight. Was Cotty F. et al. Effects of anabolic steroids on the muscle cells of strength-trained athletes. What they do is they looked at elite powerlifters, 9 of whom had been using lots of anabolic steroids and 10 of whom were natural. And they looked at their traps and found that in the drug-using powerlifters, there was indication of hyperplasia, not just through fiber count. There were some other molecular indicators that seemed to suggest that there was actual hyperplasia going on. I think it's interesting that it was in the trapezius, which we know has a high number of androgen receptors, which is why people who take anabolics get so fucking yoked. So that could be muscle specific, but again, it is at least indirectly supportive of those earlier McDougall studies. Of course, as with the two McDougall studies, we have the added factor of anabolic steroids, which might be playing a role directly or indirectly in all of this. So going back to methodology, we asked, well, how's this all measured? So in animals, you train one paw, leg, whatever side and not the other, and you sacrifice them and grind them down, and however they do it, they don't really hand count fibers anymore because we're talking tens of hundreds of thousands, and they use whatever biochemical means. Done. What about in humans, where you can't really do that? Well, enter the muscle biopsy. Here they use this little cutter, it's a little Pac-Man, and they cut out a chunk of the muscle. And this has been used for decades to study muscle glycogen and enzyme levels with staining, and you can use it to look at muscle fiber area and fiber typing and also fiber number through, again, whatever biochemical means that I don't understand and won't try to explain. But this introduces another tremendous set of problems. One, we're making this big assumption this little itty-bitty chunk of muscle is representative of the entire thing, which may or may not be true. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. I'm just saying that this is one of the issues that comes along with this. Now, we also, the model of muscle we have now is getting much more complicated in terms of there's differences. Fibers don't run from end to end. They overlap, and they're different superficially versus deep down, and I'm going to talk about that in part 2 of this video if I ever get to it. And so taking this little bitty chunk of the muscle out and assuming that it's representative of the entire muscle is probably not necessarily a good one. If you're looking at a longitudinal study, like a training study, right, again, you take one biopsy at the front, one biopsy at the end to compare them, well, they're coming from different parts of the muscle, and they may or may not be representative or even comparable. Now, those studies have almost universally found that there is no increase in fiber number, so that's kind of a moot point. But even looking cross-sectionally, you take this little biopsy, do whatever you're going to do to count fibers, and you're assuming it represents the whole muscle. You're even assuming it represents every muscle in the body, which is completely wrong. But even if you do see greater fiber number in one group versus another, it can't identify if that person was born with more fibers that then grew, or if they experienced hyperplasia at some point in their training career. So in both cases, we sort of have a problem. I mean, what ideally you would do like an extremely long-term training study. Get a group, muscle biopsy them, train them for 5 years, maybe give them steroids at some point, and see what happens. So you can see if the fiber number changes over time. Those studies don't exist, and they probably never will exist. So this is what we've got, is getting this little snapshot of a muscle to either compare before and after training or to compare groups. And this brings in even another problem that I'm going to try to go over very briefly. Which brings us to an issue that I probably should have addressed earlier, which is like, what does hyperplasia actually mean? I know I said it's an increase in muscle fiber number, but what does that actually mean? Well, it could be a couple things, right? You have all these stacked muscle fibers. It could mean that you're getting an entirely new fiber that's being made, or in some cases, it's thought to represent one fiber kind of splitting into two, like a two-headed snake. Frequently, they'll get into the whole issue of satellite cell number and whether or not those are increasing, and that may be involved in this. But when you're taking a biopsy and you're taking this little slice of the muscle, well, let's say that you do see an increase in fiber number. Well, you don't even know that that's an entirely new fiber. It may just be one that's split a little bit. Some people even think that hyperplasia is nothing more than repairing damaged tissue and might not even represent an adaptation. All of this is compounded by the biopsy. All of this is compounded by the limitations in our ability to measure it. Again, down the road, we may have a non-invasive way to do this and get good, better answers. But for right now, this is what we're limited to by not only the methodology we've got available, but the disclarity of what hyperplasia might actually represent. And I don't want to get into more details about that because it's boring. So let me try to finish this up. Which brings me back to the reason that this is part of the conversation again, which is due to a brand new study that just came out, which is long-term resistance trained human muscles have more fibers, more myofibrils, and tighter myofilament packing than untrained. MedSci Sports Exercise 2024, blah, 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 by Mayo S. et al. And I will put the link both to the paper and the ResearchGate full text in the notes if I remember. So in this study, which was cross-sectional, they took 13 individuals that were long-term resistance training, 6 plus or minus about 3.5 years, and compared them to untrained individuals. They did a muscle biopsy and MRI of the biceps, did the standard stuff in terms of comparing fiber number and myofibril density, and they looked at a whole bunch of different stuff. And the long and the short of it was that they found that the individuals with long-term resistance training had larger muscles, but also had an apparent increase in muscle fiber number. They concluded the main findings of this study were that long resistance trained individuals who had 70% larger muscles than untrained also had larger size and a greater number, plus 34% of muscle fibers within the cross-sectional area, a tendency for smaller myofibrils, but more myofibrils per fiber, and in total smaller myosin spacing, greater packing density. Blah, blah, blah. These findings mostly supported our hypotheses that suggest that the larger muscles of long-term resistance-trained individuals were characterized as having muscle fibers of greater size and number in cross-section, which likely contains smaller but more myofibrils as well as more tightly packed myofilaments. So this seems at least broadly consistent with some of those earlier studies in elite bodybuilders and powerlifters, and that folks with 6+ years of training did appear to have more muscle fibers, but we have all the same limitations. Biopsy, with all those issues, the fact that it's cross-sectional, not a training study. We don't know if the people were born with more muscle fibers, and that's why they're big, or if the training led to an increase in fiber number. And there's no way to do that short of doing a very long-term training study with before and after biopsies, and that just doesn't exist. And there were other limitations having to do with the way the fibers number is estimated and the actual methodology, but that's inherent to all these studies, so it's not really kind of a deal breaker on this one. They also mentioned a component of circularity having to do with the way they are calculating fiber number is basically factoring in muscle size. So it's like the bigger muscle will automatically yield larger fiber numbers, whether it's true or not. Regardless of that, in regards to the fact that the fitness injury is making much to do about nothing about this, it is at least supportive of the idea that maybe under certain conditions, possibly based on the limited methodology we have, that skeletal fiber hyperplasia may occur. Let me start to sum up. So does skeletal muscle hyperplasia occur? In the animal studies, I think it's fairly conclusive to say that yes, that it does, but it occurs in conjunction with hypertrophy, after hypertrophy has reached a certain point, and is of a smaller magnitude than the hypertrophy itself. We also have the issue that most of the studies in animals don't use training models that have any relevance to humans. Once again, holding a lengthened partial for a couple seconds, not being equivalent of 30 continuous days of stretching. But what about humans? The data there is a lot more mixed. but I think a pattern does start to show up. If you're looking at fiber number in short-term training of relatively untrained individuals, the answer is a conclusive no. It has not been shown to occur. When you start looking cross-sectionally, acknowledging the limitations of doing that and acknowledging the limitations of the biopsy, which is all we have right now, there is evidence that it occurs, albeit indirect, but it's occurring in trainees that have trained for an extremely long period of time, where presumably their muscles have maybe reached a size where hyperplasia is stimulated. Also, you frequently have the confound of drug use. But now this actually raises a more important question to me, the one that I'll come back to at the end of the video, actually talk about the next topic, and that question is, so what? So to seg into the next topic, one thing that relatively new paper also looked at on top of fiber number and all that other stuff was the composition of the muscle fibers, the fiber types. And what they found is that there was no difference in the relative percentage of fiber types between the individuals who had been training for long periods of time and untrained. Let's move on. So let me move on to a topic that is related in it deals with muscle fibers, but it's also related in that it's another long-standing argument, controversy, and issue that comes up from time to time. It's also related in that a lot of what I'm going to say about this topic is similar to what I said in the previous topic, so hopefully I can keep it from being quite so long. And specifically what I'll look at is the issue of fiber type conversion, right? So within your muscle, which is made up of myofibers, which is made up of myofibrils and other stuff, there are different types of fibers that have different physiological characteristics. And a very long-standing question has been, can these fibers convert from one type to another? And for this to make sense, as usual, a little background on fiber types. So the science of fiber typing goes back actually several hundred years. And the different types of muscle fibers within a muscle have been examined in a number of different ways, all looking at slightly different things, which means that they develop slightly different concepts, but that are all basically related. So some of the earliest, and I imagine many of you heard of this, found that muscle fibers, probably within animals, were either red or white, or like think about turkey, right? You have dark meat, which is darker, and then you have light meat, which is whiter. And that turns out to have relationships to the general physiological characteristics of those muscles. So we move forward a little bit, and they started, another way they looked at different muscle fiber types had to do with enzyme activity. So they would take a muscle and cut it up and make it into stew or goulash, whatever they do, and they would mark it for things like enzymes that were involved in oxidative aerobic metabolism, stuff like citrate synthase and stuff, or they would look at enzymes that were involved in glycolytic pathways. And what they generally found was that the red fibers tended to be more oxidative, and the white fibers were more glycolytic, right? Oxidative, aerobic, tends to be good for long duration activities, lower force requirements over extended periods of time. Glycolytic fibers, the opposite. They generate more force, but for shorter periods of time, they fatigue more quickly. So that leads into another categorization, which was generally fast and slow twitch fibers. And again, the darker fibers, the more aerobic fibers are slow twitch, and the whiter fibers are fast twitch. Now what that actually refers to is how long it takes for the muscle fiber to twitch, to generate force when it's sent a neurological signal. And a lot of real ignorance has come out of this idea based on that terminology. Because you'll hear people go, well, if you train slowly, you only train the slow twitch fibers, and you have to train fast to train the fast twitch fibers, and that's just bullshit. Because the differences in twitch times are not that big. It's something like fast twitch will generate force in like 25 milliseconds. And the slow twitch, maybe 50 up to 100 milliseconds. Now an eye blink is about 300 milliseconds. So these times, yes, 100 milliseconds is relatively slower than 25. And while I've seen some truly shitty high-speed lifting, Nobody's coming close. The fiber recruitment is based on force production. And anyone who thinks that a slow grinding 1 rep max bench press is only using slow twitch fibers because it's slow is ignorant as shit, which means they're part of the fitness industry. So that was another one, right? So then those kind of got combined. And again, I'm not trying to do an accurate history. I just want to give some terminology. So it turned out that the slow twitch fibers tend to be more oxidative. Those are now called slow oxidative fibers. And the fast twitch could actually be a couple of different things. There were fast oxidative fibers, so they were fast twitch, but they showed characteristics of slow twitch. And then there were fast glycolytic that were fast twitch fibers, but with more glycolytic enzymes. So already we're starting to see there's a continuum. And there's a bigger continuum in terms of force production, fatigability, enzyme activities, growth potential, with fast twitch fibers generally showing much greater growth than slow twitch fibers. That would then give way to another fiber typing. And again, I'm sure I'm forgetting some. Don't get in my ass. I'll give you a reference that gives a better history of this in the notes. And we got into muscle fiber types. And I'm sure most of y'all have seen type 1, which are your slow twitch or slow oxidative. Type 2A, type 2 is just fast twitch in general. And they were type 2A, which are the same as the fast oxidative glycolytic. And in the early schemes, there was type 2B. The problem is that was based on animal models. Humans don't actually have type 2B muscle fibers. And if you've read my older books, you'll see me list that because that was the model at the time. In my newer books, in as much as I ever talk about this, that's not the case. Because we know now that the human equivalent of the type 2B fiber in animals is 2X. Right? Animals, type 1, slow twitch, slow oxidative. Type 2A, fast twitch, fast oxidative. Type 2B, fast glycolytic. In humans, the equivalents are type 1, type 2A, type 2X. And that was a model for the longest time. And that's based on something called myosin heavy chain, which is just a molecular way of looking at this. So it's not just looking at the color, it's not looking at the enzymes, it's not looking at the twitch characteristics, not looking at a mixture, it's actually looking at the molecular makeup of this. And again, these all have different physiological characteristics. And I'll hopefully be able to type this up into a chart that's not really that relevant, other than all you need to know, type 1, slow twitch, aerobic, oxidative. Type 2A, fast twitch, can actually be oxidative or glycolytic depending on how you train them. And then 2X, fast glycolytic, is the equivalent of that. You may have also, if you're more involved in rehab type stuff, heard the terms phasic and tonic muscles, which has to do with how they fire. Tonic muscles tend to be postural. They show a generally tonic contraction pattern, and those are your type 1 fibers. They're involved in long-term posture. Then your phasic fibers, the ones that are good at generating force phasically, intermittently, higher force, short periods of time to fatigue quickly, those are your type 2 fibers. So that's sort of a general scheme, which I've tried to summarize badly to show you how these all equivalate in the next image. So I've summarized this here. You've got the original red and white fibers based on the actual color of the tissue, which were sort of the equivalent of slow twitch and fast twitch fibers. Slow twitch is slow oxidative due to its general enzyme activity, mitochondria, capillaries. Fast twitch, fast oxidative glycolytic, and fast glycolytic. In animals, that is the equivalent of type 1, 2A, and 2B. In humans, we have type 1, 2A, and 2X. Then I list some of the characteristics. Contraction speed, from slowest to fastest, slow, fast, faster. Fatigue rate, slow, fast, faster. Enzymes, oxidative. I said oxidative glycolytic on those type 2A fibers because which one you get depends on how you train. And then fast glycolytic, highest, most glycolytic. Mitochondrial density, high, medium, low. That's consistent with the other characteristics. Force output and growth potential, I put low, higher, and then highest, sort of, and I'll explain that momentarily. So before moving on, a couple of points. The first is that while we sort of separate these in distinct categories, it's a wrong way to think of it. All fiber types are on a continuum. So with type 1, you have the most aerobic oxidative, and then there's various populations that are still technically type 1 fibers, but are relatively less aerobic and more glycolytic as they approach type 2A fibers. which can be, as I mentioned, oxidative or glycolytic and some mixture depending on which population they are and also how you train. And when you recruit them, if you train them with aerobic training and they become more oxidative, you train them with weight training more glycolytic, and I'll come back to that. And then finally, fast glycolytic, the type 2X, which is the most. But again, we have to draw a line somewhere, but this is a continuum of fibers. Now, going back to the myosin, the type 1, 2A, 2X thing, and the myosin heavy chains, that's really the current model and the current way that this is determined, because every muscle has 2 light chains that, so far as I can tell, don't mean anything, and then 2 heavy chains. And it's the mixture of those 2 heavy chains that actually determines the specific fiber type. And you can have hybrids. So you can have a pure type 1. You can have, I believe, a type 1, type 2 intermediate fiber. You can have a pure type 2A. You can have a type 2A, 2X, and you can have a pure type 2X, which kind of shows that continuum across those fiber types. And that determines which specific characteristics it has. A pure type 2A will have more of those pure type characteristics from that chart than a 2AX, or a 2X that has both myosin heavy chains. And that's relevant because it brings me into the next issue. So the question then becomes, can these fiber types interconvert? And even a million years ago when I went to university, the answer that we knew then was yes and no, which was it was well known that within type 2 fibers, depending on how you trained, you could see shifts in their relative physiological characteristics. So let's say you're doing interval training on a bike. You're training the type 2 fibers. They will tend to become more oxidative. Whereas if you're training the type 2 fibers in the weight room or with sprint training, they tend to become more glycolytic. So within those type 2 fibers, we knew that there could be shifts. But could type 1 turn into type 2 or vice versa? And the party line for the longest time was no. It just hadn't been seen to occur in any physiological condition, right? Now, you could cause it to occur if you switched motor nerves, right? So they would take a type 1 and a type 2 fiber, and they would take the motor nerve from here and switch it to the other and vice versa. And then you would see a shift in the fiber type because that neural input seemed to be a big determinant of what type of fiber was being shown. And there were other ways, but it was like expose the fiber to high doses of thyroid and stuff like that, but it was nothing really relevant to training. Now, once we got into the myosin heavy chain, once we got into those details, it became clear that there was a little bit more going on here, although it was very similar, which was that, again, within the type 2 fibers, you could see more significant shifts. Well, actually, that's not true. There was this intermediate population of fibers, those type 1, 2A fibers. And A, they don't make a huge percentage of muscle. It's like 10% in that range. Don't swim me to that number, but it's not much. And early training will determine which way they go. So if they are exposed to an aerobic stimulus, yeah, they will tend to shift to type 1. And if they are exposed to more of an anaerobic stimulus, they'll shift to a pure 2A. But that's really a minority population. And by the time you're listening to this video, it's too fucking late for you to worry about those. But within that type 2 population, it became very clear that there could be shifts. But it was only in both directions, but really only one that mattered. And what was found that is pretty much whenever you trained any type of high intensity work, type 2X fibers would basically disappear. They would turn into 2A, pure 2A. And like in some studies, like they would be before or after, whatever the type 2X population was, it would drop to like 0 to 3%. So it definitely went one direction. Now, if you severely detrained, like took weeks off, those 2A fibers could reconvert into 2X. And there was an incredibly dumb idea back in the day that by tapering for 3 weeks and detraining, that you can improve performance, and that's never been shown to occur. The 2X are really thought to be sort of dormant fibers. You also see them in the legs of people in wheelchairs who are unable to train. You see massive type 2X populations. But again, it's just sort of a storage fiber. As soon as you recruit them, they turn to 2A in the grand majority. The question then becomes, can type 1 become type 2? And that's really more the issue that I want to talk about, because that's where some of the debate still comes in. The 2A, 2X thing, there's no debate there. Recruit 2X fibers, they become 2A. Detrain 2A fibers, they become 2X. That small population of intermediate fibers can go either way, but only in untrained. And again, the big debate, can type 1 turn into type 2 or vice versa? And the answer to that question is very similar to the hyperplasia question, which is it's very, very, very difficult to measure. So one thing that's frequently done, right? So if you take the average person and you measure most muscles, it's about 50% type 1 and 50% type 2. It's in that range, right? It's specific muscle groups frequently are predominantly one fiber or the other. That's where we get into the phasic tonic thing, right? So the gastroc, the bigger part of the calf, which is used for jumping and sprinting, tends to be more type 2 fibers, whereas the soleus, which is more of a postural muscle, tends to be type 1. Again, not purely. You only see like pure type 1, type 2 in animals who are very evolved for specific things. In humans, it's always a mixture. Now, for decades, they've done things like, let's take biopsies of elite athletes in specific sports. So they'll do calves, and they'll take the calf muscle of a runner and find like 90% type 1 fibers. Or they'll take a muscle that's involved in strength power sports, and they'll find this massive percentage of type 2 fibers. You've probably heard that women on average have more type 1 fibers than men, and that's true-ish, but it's very complicated, and I don't want to get into that, and it's not universally true, even if it's true on average. That's a whole separate issue. But maybe you can see the problem. And it's just like the hyperplasia thing, because you may be wondering, well, how do they measure fiber typing? With a biopsy. So we take 2 elite endurance athletes, or 2 elite athletes in different sports, and we take a single biopsy, and we see, all right, the endurance guy has more type 1. Strength power guy has more type 2. Well, were they born that way, which is why they happened to become elite, or was it a consequence of long-term training? And a muscle biopsy can't answer that when it's taken cross-sectionally. And the same thing occurs in longitudinal studies. And it's actually the same exact thing, where generally speaking, you don't see huge fiber shifts. Well, you don't see shifts between type 1 and type 2, except for that small portion of intermediate fibers, which can go either way. 2X always disappear across the board, but from type 1 to type 2 or vice versa, that doesn't happen in studies, which are short-term. So we have the exact same issues with hyperplasia. Short-term longitudinal studies, they don't see it. Long-term studies, you frequently see massive differences at the level, but we can't tell if it's genetic or training induced. So the question isn't really answered in that sense. Another issue with the biopsy, which gets even worse, it's now recognized that different portions of the muscle, superficial versus deep, can have different relative proportions of fiber types, presumably based on function or whatever reason we evolved this way or created this way by the flying spaghetti monster, whatever your personal theology. So where you're taking the biopsy, whether it's superficial, deep, what part of the muscle, proximal, distal, central, may be impacting on fiber percentage. So being able to accurately compare this is extremely difficult. So where does that leave us? Well, Andy Galpin is really been, I think, pushing a lot of this forward lately in some of his really, really good research. And he's done a couple of interesting studies. One they looked at elite weightlifters and found like some of the highest type 2 fiber numbers that had ever been seen, including one female that was like 95%. She had more type 2 fibers than the men, which goes against that previous data set, but neither here nor there. And they still had about 10% of 2X, which is more than usual, but it's still pretty minority. But again, the question is, were they born with that fiber type, which is why they were good at their sport, which is why they became elite? Or did the long-term training cause them to develop that incredible type 2 fiber content? There's always the possibility that it's both. Perhaps these folks were born with a proportionally greater number of type 2 fibers. That's why they were good at Olympic lifting. That's why they pursued it. And the years of continuous training continue to develop them further. We don't know. And based on current methodology, we can't know. So Dr. Galpin did another really interesting paper, actually a year before the weightlifting one, but I don't organize these things, as you realize. It was really interesting. And so what he did was he found two identical twins, monozygotic twins, one of whom had performed endurance training, running and triathlon for 30 straight years, and the other one who had not performed any regular exercise. And he had the whole battery of tests, body fat, blood lipids, blah, 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 muscle strength. But really interesting was they took a muscle biopsy of the quads. And they found that the endurance-trained twin had 55% higher type 1 muscle fibers than the twin that didn't exercise, which, kind of like the other data I looked at with hyperplasia, suggests that maybe over 20 years of training with a chronic stimulus to a singular type of adaptation, you do see fiber type shifting. But it's still only indirect. We know now that even identical twins aren't identical. Maybe they were born with that different fiber type. I doubt that's the case, but it's possible, right? When you get involved in an activity early, if you suck at it and you have any sense, you quit. And if you have the fiber type and physiology to be good at it, you pursue it. So there's a huge selection bias here. But that's at least suggestive. But again, we can't do the studies. We can't non-invasively measure fiber typing. You can't start with a beginner, fiber type them, train them for 5 or 10 years or however long this might take to see if fiber type transitions are occurring. Like I said, it's identical to the hyperplasia stuff. It's the same problem, it's the same question, it's the same debate, and we run into the exact same issues. So let me sum up. So I dare say the data on fiber type conversion is even weaker than the hyperplasia stuff. We know that there's interconversion between type 2 fibers. 2X become 2A pretty much across the board. The debate is whether type 1 fibers can become type 2 or vice versa with chronic training. And there's at best a limited amount of indirect data. But let's say maybe it does happen. And future data may show that it does. I ask the same question as I asked with hyperplasia, which is, so what? This is one of those topics that comes up from time to time. It actually came up in my Facebook group a couple years ago, and they had read Andy's data, and Andy Galpin does some great work. Do not mishear me within the limitations of what we are able to do at this point, and said, yeah, I've read this stuff, and he's suggesting that we can get fiber type conversion. What they wanted to know was, like, yes, is it true that this happens, but more importantly, what can they do with that? And I said basically the same thing I've said here. I said, yeah, I mean, Dr. Galpin's data is the data, and it's good data, and it's suggestive that maybe it does happen over extremely extended periods of time. But as far as what we can do with it, the answer is nothing, practically. The things that have been shown to cause this type of fiber shifting in research, it typically uses non-physiological interventions, like I said, high-dose thyroid thrown into a tube and neuromuscular, switching the nerves and things that we simply can't do. What can I do with this? And I said, well, you have no real control over this. Just like you have no control over hyperplasia. In the case of hyperplasia, we know several things. Yes, it may occur in humans, but we know that A, hypertrophy is still the grand majority of where your growth comes from. That if hyperplasia occurs, it's not till very late in the game when you reach near your genetic potential. And taking steroids is probably the best way to get it to happen in the first place, along with those other factors. So yeah, it might occur, but you can't make it occur. And if it's going to occur when it occurs. So why fucking worry about it? Same thing with a fiber type transition. Maybe it does occur over 5, 10, 20 years of continuous training. We can't do anything to control it. By which I mean there is no hyperplasia-specific training that you can do in the weight room. There is no type 1 to type 2 fiber conversion training that you can do as an endurance athlete. We do not have the ability to do that. However, we do have the ability to do one and exactly one thing. This is what I told the person who asked about the fiber typing. This is what I would tell anybody who's asking about hyperplasia. And that's just train to your fucking goal and stop worrying about it. That is the punchline of this 45-minute video. Does hyperplasia occur? Probably, maybe, who knows? But who fucking cares? Does fiber type conversion occur? Yeah, maybe, probably, but who fucking cares? Until we can train in a specific way to cause this to occur, and we can, in a sense, it's not worth worrying about. Train to your goal. If you want to be a bodybuilder and get bigger muscles, do hypertrophy training. If you want to be a power lifter, you focus on the power lifts in generally lower repetitions, and you don't fucking run. And if you want to be a runner or an endurance athlete, you do your endurance sport, and you don't train like a fucking powerlifter. You train to your goal: strength, power, hypertrophy, distance training. And the body is going to do what it's going to do, and it'll figure it out. As I'm going to discuss in a future video series, there's a concept in training called cited, specific adaptations to imposed demands, which is exactly what it sounds like. It means that the body will adapt in response to the specifically imposed demands that are put upon it. And that's what the body's going to do. You send a continuous signal to adapt in a certain way, the body is going to do it, and it's going to do what it's going to do, which is what it's going to do. And that's it. If that includes hyperplasia down the road, fan-fucking-tastic. If that includes type 1 to type 2 or type 2 to type 1 fiber conversion, also fan-fucking-tastic. Other than training to your goal, there's nothing you can do about it. So it's not worth worrying about. And that's really it. Are these interesting questions physiologically? Absolutely. Do they interest me from a nerd level? Fucking absolutely, clearly. Are they relevant in a practical sense? Absolutely not. Because they don't change anything about what you're going to do, right? When the new hyperplasia study came out, of course, Brad Schoenfeld jumped on it. Interesting. And I told someone in my Facebook group, because little baby has me blocked, said, go ask him practically what this relevance this has for training. And the person did, and Brad ignored them. Answered lots of other questions to keep the midwits that follow him impressed. But he knows full well that it doesn't change shit about how we're going to train. If fiber type conversion occurs, it doesn't change shit about how we're going to train. Not at this point, other than for me to say, train to your goal the way we know how, the body's going to sort it out, and stop worrying about it. And yes, I just spent 50 minutes of blathering to make roughly 1 minute conclusion about this topic. But now, assuming you sat through all this bullshit, you know more about the topics of hypertrophy and hyperplasia, along with the possibility of fiber type transitions, than the grand majority of supposed professionals in the fitness industry. So if nothing else, you'll be able to see through their bullshit when they spew it. See you next time. For the record, I neither read nor respond to comments on YouTube or Instagram, because I don't care. Mind you, I don't delete comments I don't like most of the weak-minded babies in this industry either. If you think my content is great and want to tell me how awesome I am, fantastic. If you think I'm a dumb asshole and want to call me names, also fantastic. I don't care either way, because I have better things to do. If you have questions that you want me to potentially read and or respond to, or most likely ignore, send them to questions@bodyrecomposition.com. Might get to them, might not. It's part of my charm. Oh yeah, I recently added a playlist to my channel. My buddy Solomon Nelson, who does some fantastic videos taking down the cretins in this industry. I've put the link directly to that playlist in the video comments, and you can also find them however you find playlists. He deserves the exposure. Go check him out.